All right, welcome. Hi, everybody. I am Laura Desmond, curator at the Monhegan Museum of Art and History and member of the Monhegan Associates Ecology Committee. And I'd like to welcome you to this event in our 2026 program series, a collaboration between the Monhegan Museum of Art and History and the Monhegan Associates. I'd like to begin by welcoming all of the Monhegan Museum and Monhegan Associates members who are joining us tonight. Your support really does make events like this possible, so thank you. If you're not already a member, it's quick and easy to join by going to our respective websites and clicking on the donate buttons. We would love to welcome you to our community of support for preservation of Monhegan's wildlands and its cultural and artistic heritage. I'd like also to give a warm welcome to our board members who are here, as well as to those of you who are attending one of our programs for the first time. We're glad to have you among us. A big thank you to both the Monhegan Associates and the Monhegan Museum of Art and History for collaborating on this year's series of lectures and programs. Just a few logistical matters. This presentation is in webinar format. In this format, you can see and hear the host and speaker, but nobody can see or hear you, so you needn't worry about background noise or touch up your appearance. In this format, you won't be able to ask questions directly, but if you do have a question, you can click on the Q&A button and type in your question. We'll try to get to everybody's questions at the end of the presentations. Tonight's lecture will be recorded, and if all goes well, will be posted on the Monhegan Associates and Monhegan Museum websites. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker tonight, Dr. Bonnie Newsom. Dr. Newsom is a citizen of the Penobscot Nation and an archaeologist whose work focuses on the past lifeways of Wabanaki peoples. She serves as an associate professor of anthropology and a faculty associate at the Climate Change Institute at the University of Maine. Her research and mentorship span Wabanaki archaeology, regional coastal shell heap stewardship, the impact of climate change on cultural heritage, community-based archaeological practices, and indigenous ceramic technologies. Dr. Newsom teaches courses on archaeology and historic preservation and leads the prestigious Maine Wabanaki Passamaquoddy Indigenous Partnership Archaeological Field School. This experiential field program introduces students to Indigenous community engagement, coastal shell heap archaeology, and the intersection of climate change with cultural heritage. Through her scholarship, Dr. Newsom strives to honor and humanize ancestral Wabanaki peoples by illuminating their knowledge systems, values, skills, and achievements. She has authored and co-authored articles in the Journal of Field Archaeology, Advances in Archaeological Practice, Nature Communications, and Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Her professional experience includes serving as the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Penobscot Nation and as the Assistant Director of the University of Maine's Wabanaki Center. She maintains a strong record of public service, having served as the chair of the Repatriation Review Committee for the National Museum of Natural History and as a member of the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission. Her talk tonight is entitled Swordfish in Wabanaki Homeland. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bonnie Newsom.
Thank you very much for that great introduction. I'm really thrilled to be here tonight. My talk tonight is focusing on swordfish in Wabanaki Homeland, and this is some research that I've undertaken with some colleagues, including Dr. Arthur Spees with the Maine Historic Preservation Officer, Dr. Catherine Allen with Earth and Climate Sciences at the University of Maine, and Sky Heller with the Hudson Museum, also at the University of Maine. And I'll start briefly by giving you just a little overview of what I'll be talking about tonight. To situate you culturally, I'll begin with a brief introduction to the Wabanaki peoples and what shell heaps are. Then I'll discuss archaeological evidence of swordfish hunting in Maine, And finally, I'll discuss some recent research that we're doing on radiocarbon dates of swordfish from archaeological sites in Maine, and then we can open it up to some questions afterwards. So to begin, I want to introduce you to the indigenous peoples of the region. Wabanaki is a term used to refer to the Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, Penobscot, and Abenaki peoples. And it's a collective term that translates to people of the Dawnland or people of first light. To orient you geographically, here are two maps. On the left is a map of the ancestral homelands of the Wabanaki peoples and a general depiction of how Wabanaki peoples organized themselves on the landscape prior to European contact. The map on the right shows tribal lands today, with the exception of the green, which represents conservation lands. All other highlighted lands are Wabanaki lands. The maroon is Penobscot Nation land. Blue is Passamaquoddy land. Orange in northern Maine is Maliseet, as is yellow. Yellow in northern Maine is Mi'kmaq. And so you can see here kind of the real difference in terms of how people can engage with heritage places based on their former and current land bases. The four federally recognized tribes within Maine borders all have community centers in their homeland. Mi'kmaq Nation is located the farthest north in Presque Isle. The Houlton Band of Maliseet Indians are near the Maine-Canada border in Houlton. The Passamaquoddy tribe has two reservation communities, one at Indian Township or Madocmigook, and the other at Pleasant Point or Sibaik. And finally, Penobscot Nation has a central community on Indian Island near Old Town. All communities have a leadership structure with a chief and council, and each has representation in a state legislature. Legislative reps can introduce legislation but cannot vote. And each community is a separate and sovereign nation. While we all are collective in the way of being under the Wabanaki umbrella, we are each a sovereign nation and represent our own interests, only coming together for areas of common interests. So the indigenous peoples of the region have a 12,000-year history, and much of that record, the historical record for indigenous peoples, is encapsulated in subsurface archaeological spaces, oral narratives, and intergenerational memory, and petroglyph sites. The image on the left is an artist's rendition of Gluskab, and Gluskab is our cultural teacher who's said to be responsible for the creation of people by shooting an arrow into an ash tree from which people emerged. And central to his teaching are three sacred concepts. And the first was the power of the Great Spirit, or Kchinuesk. And the Great Spirit is a life force that is in all living beings. And because we all share that same life force, we're all related. And that includes our non-human relatives as well. The second is that Wabanaki people must never leave this land that this Great Spirit gave them. And the third is that Wabanaki people must never forget their first mother, the earth, and show their love for her. So these teachings are values that are rooted in Wabanaki culture and have been for likely millennia. In the center is a photo of Passamaquoddy petroglyphs from Machias Bay. And these are images that are packed into the stone, and they are also a way to convey information about Wabanaki Pass. And finally, the image on the right is a picture of archaeological excavations at a site in Eddington, Maine. And places such as this also preserve indigenous pasts. Archaeological sites in the region are both terrestrial and coastal, and swordfish remains have been found in both coastal settings and also inland. So Maine is home to an estimated 2,000 indigenous coastal shell heaps or shell-bearing sites, and these represent roughly 5,000 years of native families living on the coast. And most of the sites are threatened by sea level rise and other climate change related impacts, such as increased storm intensity and frequency and irregular freeze-thaw cycles. For Maine's indigenous communities, coastal shell-bearing sites are remnants of a built heritage that really tell the story of our connections to place. But these places are often marginalized and not afforded the same attention as the built heritage of settler societies. And marginalization of Wabanaki coastal shell-bearing spaces renders Indigenous past really socially invisible and contributes to the historic erasure of Indigenous peoples in the region and their collections to place. Soft shell clam dominates most of the shell heaps. However, oyster mounds exist as well and are prominent in the Damascotta River area. And while most of the coastal sites reflect the last 3,000 years of Wabanaki lifeways, a few of them date to what archaeologists call the late Archaic period or the Archaic period. And this is the time between roughly 6,000 and 3,000 years ago. And this is a time in which swordfish appears as part of indigenous foodways. This slide helps to explain this time period as archaeologists have interpreted indigenous pasts. And these are very different interpretations than what Wabanaki people might use to explain their pasts. On the left, you'll see the Moorhead phase, and on the right is the Susquehanna tradition. And this outline here covers kind of these archaeological constructs, and these are a part of a larger cultural chronology for Maine. So you can see that these archaeological units date to between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago. And they've drawn substantial archaeological interest over the years. And this is because cultural changes among Indigenous peoples occur at this time, as evidenced by apparent shifts in subsistence strategies, changes in mortuary practices, and changes in material culture. For example, the Moorhead phase on the left is characterized by a maritime and terrestrial food gathering strategy. We also see during this time very sophisticated groundstone tool technologies. Moorhead phase is also a time when we see elaborate ceremonial practices associated with burials, and we don't excavate burials anymore. There are laws to protect them, and many of the materials recovered from burials previously have been returned to Native people across this country due to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. But from past excavations, we know that people living during this time period, particularly what's referred to as the Moorhead phase, buried their dead with large quantities of powdered hematite or red ochre. And some archaeologists have interpreted swordfish hunting as a distinct characteristic of this group. In contrast, people associated with what's called the Susquehanna tradition engage in cremation mortuary practices, and they relied really heavily on a very sophisticated flakestone tool technology, and you can see some examples on the right here. Archaeological interpretations have suggested that people living during this time focused on terrestrial mammals, acorns, other nuts, and swordfish generally do not occur within these contexts. So regional scholars, archaeologists have interpreted the Susquehanna tradition in Maine as evidence of people coming into the region from places like New York and New England due to similarities in material culture and other cultural characteristics between the two regions. The relationship between peoples assigned to the Morehead phase and Susquehanna tradition is really unresolved, and I don't think we have a really good handle on that. Um, some have suggested movement of peoples versus diffusion of ideas, and I think more research is needed to really understand the relationship between these two archaeological constructs. Although differences exist between the two, archaeological evidence shows that the two cultural traditions sometimes will occur at the same location at multiple sites across the state. But it's often these are often separated either stratigraphically because of being Susquehanna is a later time period, or spatially within a particular site. Um, so to date, any kind of sociocultural explanations regarding the reuse of locations for particularly mortuary activities and other activities by potentially different groups are underexplored and poorly understood. And so I think this is an area, one of the big questions is what is the relationship between the Morehead phase and the Susquehanna tradition? And how do those folks relate to each other? So this slide highlights a key pattern in the archaeological record from the Gulf of Maine. First, we see evidence that swordfish were present in the Gulf of Maine between 5,000 and 3,800 years ago, and multiple sites from this period include swordfish remains, showing that these fish were locally accessible and actively hunted. What's striking is that the evidence ends abruptly at about 3,800 years ago. And after that point, swordfish disappear from the archaeological record, even though people continue living and using coastal sites, and even the same ones that we find swordfish at. Today, swordfish don't regularly enter the Gulf of Maine. And that contrast suggests that ocean conditions in the past, especially temperatures, were different. And taken together, the archaeological pattern points to warmer Gulf of Maine waters during this time period, and followed by environmental changes that likely made swordfish less accessible or absent from the region. To understand why swordfish appear abruptly in the Gulf of Maine and then disappear, we really need to place this pattern within the broader context of what's called Holocene climate variability. And the Holocene is defined as the most recent interval of the Earth's history, beginning approximately 11,700 years ago and continuing to the present day. And it encompasses significant climate events and can be subdivided into various chronological divisions. But we recognize that the Holocene was not stable in terms of climate, even though it lacks kind of the dramatic ice sheet and fluctuations of earlier times. Instead, it's characterized by a series of rapid climate change events, which occurred on either centennial or millennial scales, and were fast enough to matter to both ecosystems and human societies. Several of these rapid climate changes correspond well to the late Archaic period in the Northeast, in particular, intervals that have been documented at approximately 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, 6,000 to 5,000 years ago, 4,200 to 3,800, and 35 to 2,500, and so on. And these events reflect shifts in atmospheric surface temperatures during these rapid climate changes. And they would have affected swordfish habitat fairly directly. So some archaeologists have attempted to use this to interpret why archaeological swordfish remains stop occurring in the archaeological record. Both David Sanger, both in 1975 and 2009, hypothesized that a reduction in the sea surface temperatures affected swordfish habitat. Also, sea level rise and an increase in tidal range may have affected swordfish presence in the Gulf of Maine, and a shift, particularly from micro to macro tidal Gulf, may have influenced or the habitat for swordfish to be in the Gulf of Maine. So this framework really helps shift the question from, why did people stop hunting swordfish to what environmental thresholds were crossed that made swordfish no longer a reliable uh, uh, food way. To examine this question of timing, we look to swordfish in Maine for clues to past environments. And so there are at least 11 sites in and around the Gulf of Maine that produce swordfish remains and can help to understand past human swordfish relationships plus past environmental conditions. Prior to the research I'm discussing here, the oldest dates on swordfish from the Gulf of Maine was 4290 plus or minus 60 BP from a site on Monhegan Island. And however, many radiocarbon dates taken or produced during earlier years of archaeology or in the past were never adjusted for what's referred to as the marine reservoir effect, which make them somewhat inaccurate for use in interpretations of timing of cultural or environmental shifts. So when we date archaeological materials, we use radiocarbon dating very often, which relies on measuring the radiocarbon form of the radioactive form of carbon, which is carbon 14. On land, plants and animals are in really close balance with the atmosphere, so their carbon 14 levels reflect the atmosphere at the time in which they lived. But the ocean works differently. And much of the carbon in seawater has been circulating deep in the ocean for a very long time, sometimes centuries, before returning to the surface. That means that marine organisms take in old carbon that has less carbon 14 left in it. And when we measure these organisms through radiocarbon dating, they can look hundreds of years older than they really are. And this is what's called the marine reservoir effect. And some areas can show offsets, and it's measured in offsets. So some areas can show offsets as large as 800 to 1200 years. And so regionally, these offsets vary based on where they are. And so to correct for this, scientists calculate what's called a delta R value, and this tells how much older marine samples from a specific region appear. So we can adjust radiocarbon dates and get an accurate timeline. Without this correction, our understanding of past coastal lifeways, cultural connectedness, and climate events would be actually misleading. So we have to make sure that our radiocarbon dates on marine samples are corrected for this reservoir effect. Whoops, excuse me. Bear with me, apologies, folks. Okay. So how do archaeologists fix this? Well, we measure something that's called delta R, or the correction value that researchers use to tell how much a region's ocean carbon differs from the global average. And delta R values vary by place because ocean circulation, upwelling, and freshwater mixing all influence how old the carbon is in the local marine environment. But the story doesn't stop there. To uh, uh, it's the issue of how different differences in carbon intake by swordfish is also complicated by swordfish behavior because swordfish are migratory species. They uh, travel long distances and through different reservoirs. Fish tagging studies show that Atlantic swordfish migrate thousands of kilometers each year. In the North Atlantic, their movement follows a predictable seasonal pattern. They travel north in the summer to feed in temperate waters like the Scotian Shelf and Grand Banks, and then return south in the winter toward tropical and subtropical waters where spawning occurs. But they don't just migrate horizontally, they also migrate vertically through the water column every single day. So during daylight, they dive into deep, cold waters, sometimes hundreds of meters below the surface. And at night, they rise back up to the surface to feed on squid and other marine fish. And this vertical migration reflects their need to balance feeding opportunities, as well as temperature and predator avoidance. So you can see that because of the movement of swordfish combined with this notion of delta R corrections, it's really challenging to to rely on swordfish dates as a potential indicator for the timing of swordfish in the archaeological record. So one strategy for approaching this problem is to date pairs of samples from the same archaeological context or archaeological layer. One marine, like a fish bone, and one terrestrial, like a deer. When you date those side by side, you can begin to get more accurate understandings of the timing of a particular species. Land animals reflect the atmospheric carbon, which doesn't have the same aging effect. And by comparing the radiocarbon ages between land and marine samples, archaeologists can calculate the local delta R value. And so this tells them exactly how to correct the marine date. So we attempted to do this kind of research, and these are the study sites that we drew swordfish samples from and deer samples from to date. Several colleagues and I undertook this study in order to get a better understanding of how swordfish at particular heritage sites could inform our understanding of past environments. And these sites include the Turner Farm site on North Haven Island, the Nevin site in Blue Hill, the Waterside site in Sorrento, Maine, and the Stanley site on Monhegan Island. And I'll talk more about these in a moment. And we radiocarbon dated marine samples, swordfish specifically, and deer as our terrestrial samples. And we also dated two pre-World War II samples estimated to be taken from between 1880 and 1945. So the first site that I want to talk about is the Stanley site on Monhegan Island. And this site was excavated in the 1990s by Stuart Eldridge. And his research and publication on the site have been very helpful in understanding the role of swordfish in past indigenous lifeways. For those of you in the audience not familiar with Monhegan Island, it's an offshore island near Muscongas Bay, roughly 15 miles from the mainland, and it's a non-shell heap site, making it relatively unique in that regard, being on the coast. Excavations at this site produced a large amount of swordfish remains, and radiocarbon dates from those excavations range between 3,700 and 300 years before present, and these are not corrected for the marine reservoir effect. Our research on dating swordfish builds on uh, Eldridge's work, and two of the swordfish samples that we analyzed in this study are pre-World War II specimens, and these were provided by a resident of Monhegan, Alexander Alexei Krauss, and they serve as a historically well-constrained reference point that are not influenced by post 1950 nuclear carbon, which also affects the radiocarbon dates on marine samples and other samples as well. Including these samples strengthens our ability to estimate regional marine reservoir offsets and to better understand how swordfish carbon signatures actually behave. So I'm grateful that we have those pre-World War modern samples to include in this research. So the Stanley site overlooks a protected harbor formed by Manana and Smutty Nose Islands. As Eldridge emphasized, this location represents a practical landing spot for past Wabanaki peoples, a factor that strongly shaped repeated use of the site. The site's about 63 meters long and 14 meters wide, lying between 2 and 7 meters above sea level. Like many sites along the coast, it's experiencing severe erosion from winter storms and sea level rise. Um, and the Stanley site erosion situation makes the site not only culturally and scientifically important, but highly vulnerable as well. Between 1991 and 1999, Stuart Eldridge conducted a series of test excavations designed to document site depth, stratigraphy, chronology, and assemblage composition, or what was actually there. And these excavations showed that the cultural deposits, ranging from roughly 35 to 90 centimeters deep. So they were pretty deep, actually. And although the deposits appear to be fairly uniform, Eldridge identified differences in the soil texture and material culture to suggest that people reuse this location repeatedly as opposed to a one-time visit. So Monhegan Island was home to indigenous peoples for a long time, and it wasn't just an occasional stop. It was a fairly long time period where people were using that and coming back to the site. The northern portion of the site, which has suffered the most erosion, also produced the densest concentration of heritage materials, suggesting that it may have been really important to people in that area. Initial radiocarbon dating on swordfish bone provided an early date of 4290, as I mentioned earlier. And this date aligns well with what archaeologists would consider appropriate for a Moorhead phase, or what was the groundstone tool cultural manifestation or cultural construct. Um, Importantly, Eldridge's work corrected earlier interpretations, but based largely on surface collecting, demonstrating that the Stanley site preserves subsurface cultural deposits that can really inform past lifeways. So the site was richer than what was expected, and actually probably still is. So one of the most striking features of the Stanley site is the dominance of swordfish in the faunal or bone assemblage. Burned swordfish bone accounts for between 88 and nearly 99% of the identified material by weight, the bone material by weight. So there's a lot of it there. It includes rostrum fragments, vertebrae, ribs, fin rays, demonstrating that the entire swordfish carcass or that entire swordfish carcasses were transported back to the site rather than just swords or selected portions. And this evidence directly supports the site, supports on-site processing and consumption rather than the Stanley site functioning solely as a capture or transshipment location. The associated artifact assemblages reinforce this interpretation. Eldridge recovered things like plummets, which you can see in the lower right-hand corner, slate points and bayonets, pecked and ground gouges, which are probably used for woodworking, and barbed bone toggling harpoons. And these are all characteristic of the Morehead Phase coastal toolkit. And these implements are really well suited to hunting large pelagic fish and processing substantial quantities of meat and bone. There was also things like fire-cracked rock indicating hearths for cooking. There was also evidence of a broader economy because we find evidence of deer and bird and sculpin also present. So it wasn't just swordfish that they were taking. Um, and so swordfish was really embedded in this mixed marine and terrestrial food waste strategy that people were undertaking. And again, the site was used repeatedly by Wabanaki peoples. So I want to turn now to other site locations that we focused on that have evidence of swordfish, and we did test samples from these places as well. So the first is the Turner Farm site, which is located on North Haven Island in Maine, and this site was excavated by Bruce Bork in between 1971 and 1980, and I think he did a later excavation there as well. Indigenous families used this location for roughly 6,000 years, one of the oldest coastal sites that is still available or still present in Maine. Bork identified 4 occupations and assigned them to cultural and temporal units. And this site is one of the sites we have that we see both the Morehead phase archaeological construct and the Susquehanna tradition archaeological construct kind of in the same place. And dates from these excavations on swordfish range from 2970 to roughly 4410 radiocarbon years before present. Another site that produced swordfish in the state includes the Nevin site, which is in Blue Hill, Maine. This is has both a cemetery and non-cemetery areas within the site, and the swordfish that we dated is non-cemetery context that came from work done in the 2000s during some bridge work. Swordfish from this site was dated previously to 4285 plus or minus 115 years. And interestingly, the Nevin site also was a place where people were taking oysters, and we see evidence of that as well. It includes both this Morehead phase component, but also Susquehanna and later periods as well. So Nevin site is a site that's really special for Wabanaki peoples. All of our heritage sites are, but this one in particular has been on our minds quite recently because of repatriation issues. The Waterside site is in Sorrento, Maine, and also produced swordfish. Swordfish is located in Frenchman's Bay. It's now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy, which is a a conservation organization that is designed or whose mission is to protect archaeological sites. It was excavated in 1938 and 1940 by an individual named, I'm sorry, his first name escapes me, but his last name was Rowe. And the University of Maine went back to Waterside in 2013 to conduct some additional excavations there. That was part of Sky Heller's PhD project. The site is relatively narrow and sits between the shoreline and the road. The collections currently are housed, I believe, at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, and includes things like ground slate, plummets, and ceramics. Swordfish samples. One swordfish sample that we dated from this site was eroding out of the bank when they visited in 2013, and they recovered that swordfish rostrum, I believe it was, and that served as part of our study sample. So what do these sites tell us? Well, this slide really brings together what we're seeing across these four different archaeological sites and what those patterns can tell us about Wabanaki engagement with swordfish. Across all four sites, swordfish remains appear in meaningful ways. Importantly, we're not just seeing isolated pieces like rostra, but we see multiple skeletal elements, which tell us that the whole fish were consistently being brought back to communities and processed. And that shared pattern suggests a deliberate and knowledgeable engagement with swordfish rather than opportunistic or incidental use. What's striking is that this engagement happens in very different kinds of places. At Stanley and Offshore Island, we see intensive processing. At Waterside, a mainland shell-bearing site, we also see whole fish returned, as we do in places like Turner Farm in Nevin. Each site is different, but the practices at these locations overlap. And taken together, these sites point to something broader than a single site type or hunting episode. And they show a connected coastal world in which Wabanaki people shared knowledge about swordfish behavior, seasons, and safe access across landscapes. Swordfish, swordfish appear not only as a resource, but as part of a larger coastal lifeway, and one that really required planning, skill, and an understanding and a lived familiarity with the ocean. So, just briefly, I want to talk about the research results, and these are our methods. We use legacy collections from non-mortuary contexts, and legacy collections are those collections that are in institutions and probably in boxes, I suspect, Monhegan Historical Society and other historical societies around Maine have these collections, and so they make for really important collections for us as researchers to explore and use and answer important questions that might help us in interpreting not only past lifeways, but learning from past peoples to influence our behavior going forward. The sample included 8 swordfish and 5 deer, and we selected deer because it's an herbivore generally. It's very common to multiple sites, and deer preserves well in archaeological sites. All of the samples were weighed, measured, and photographed by Sky Heller, and we sent our dates off to Beta Analytic, which is a radiocarbon dating facility in Florida, and they were calibrated using InCal 20, which is a calibration tool that's available to researchers in trying to calibrate their dates. And these are our results. We have, and these are uncalibrated date ranges. So if you look, you'll see that swordfish is showing up much older than deer. And particularly if you look at the waterside example, swordfish, and these are generally from the same context, um, that swordfish does come up a bit older than deer. And these are uncalibrated. This slide really shows how you can see the difference. So this is our calibrated dates, and deer comes back at between 4,000 and 4,400. Swordfish again is coming up older between 45 and 4,800. And part of this is because these dates have not been corrected for radiocarbon, or excuse me, marine reservoir effect. So what we've done with this is we've identified uh, a radiocarbon, excuse me, we've identified a regional marine reservoir effect so that we can use these dates to come up with what's called a weighted mean that we can apply to um, our swordfish dates in order to get a more accurate reading on swordfish. And this is done with another online tool. It's called Marine 20. And so what you can do is you can actually go in for each of these dates and make those adjustments. But I think overall, if we begin to look at terrestrial deer age and marine swordfish age from similar contexts, you can see that there's quite a significant difference. So probably 300 years in some cases. So that information can now be used to help others understand the regional delta R range and the offsets to interpret radiocarbon dating from marine uh, uh, samples in the Gulf of Maine. So I'm going to wrap up now so we have some time for um, questions. So some of my conclusions thus far, delta R and late archaic swordfish samples from the Gulf of Maine averages minus 165.6 based on paired marine and terrestrial radiocarbon dates. Swordfish hunting appears to have occurred within a very narrow time frame, which hasn't changed from previous interpretations. Presence and absence of swordfish appears to coincide with rapid climate change events that occurred during the mid-Holocene. And terrestrial dates, interestingly, from this study are very close to Dr. Brian Robinson's 2001 dates from other sites east of us. So in Canada, places like Port au Choix and Cow Point. And so to close, I just want to say that while our dates may be the focus of this particular study, what this research points to is some of the necessary steps we need to take as archaeologists in order to uh, fully understand the cultural and material culture chronologies in the state, in addition to our environmental chronologies. And so we have to be very careful about the interpretations we make about indigenous peoples and um, you know, presence or absence in certain places based on radiocarbon dates. And so I just want to close by saying thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Shall I stop sharing, Laura?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and stop sharing so the people can see your nice face while while we do some Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this really fascinating presentation and for a sort of behind the scenes look at all of the work that is done in order to give us this more accurate chronology of what people when people were doing the things that they were
Mhm.
doing in the Gulf of Maine. Really fascinating. Um, we've got a few good questions here in the Q&A. A couple of them I'm going to put together. I think there's some interest in hearing about, from what you know of Wabanaki fishing culture, how what the crossing from the mainland to Monhegan might have been like in the Moorhead era, and what were some of the techniques that might have been used in capturing swordfish. I mean, I know you talked about some of the lance points and harpoons and such. So if it seems like there's some interest in hearing more about that aspect of
Yeah.
swordfish.
Okay, well, I'll answer it the best I can. We don't have any evidence of um, boats specifically. We do have one dugout canoe that was recovered down in the southern Maine I believe it's in the Brickstore Museum in Kennebunk now. So, but that dated to like 1200 years ago. So that didn't even date to as old as what I would have thought it would be.
Hmm.
But some archaeologists have suggested that many of the groundstone tools and woodworking tools um, were designed specifically for dugout canoe use. And so I think we don't know. We don't know what kind of boat technology was being used. There's been some speculation that there would be some sort of harpooning uh, technology that was associated with swordfish hunting, and that some would use the technique of letting swordfish kind of play on the line until they got tired and weak, and then they would be drugged to shore. So in that scenario, you can conceivably, I'm not familiar with places like Monhegan and what the shoreline looks like, but conceivably you might do something offshore. So remember that swordfish come to the surface at night, and we know that Wabanaki people did night fishing, particularly species like sturgeon. And so they would use long sturgeon spears or fish spears and fish by torchlight. So there could be some of that going on as well. Some archaeologists have speculated that people actually did go out in a boat and spear swordfish, probably with harpoons. If they were offshore, then they likely would have had to have. I'm thinking they would have had to have let them play out. And 'cause I just don't maybe they brought him into the boat. I don't know. But so there are a lot of unanswered questions about how people actually took swordfish. We do know that there is a porpoise hunting tradition among Wabanaki people, particularly the Passamaquoddy as well. So exploring some of those past techniques may give us some answers to how they were taking swordfish, but it's a very different fish. So,
Is it true? This is based on my own reading. Is it true that birch bark canoes were in use at a later time than swordfish were in the Gulf, or
yeah.
is that a delicate question?
Well, I think we have evidence of a birch bark basket that dates to I think it's between 6 and 8,000 years.
Okay.
And this is inland, and this is at a fish weir complex in Sebasticook Lake in Newport. And so we know they were using birch bark during the Archaic period. We don't know if they were using birch bark canoes, and I certainly don't have the evidence to say whether they were or not archaeologically. Birch bark canoes we have a really deep cultural tie to those, and it wouldn't surprise me if they went back quite deeply. Um, so I think the type of watercraft could have also been skin as well at that point. So we
That's
can't
interesting.
really rule anything out until we actually see some evidence of um, those different kinds of boat technologies.
Um, let's see, I'm looking at the Q&A here. There's a question about deer bones from the Stanley site, which I think is a surprise for some readers here. You
Yeah.
know about the more recent history of deer on the island. So would deer have is do we think that deer were on Monhegan, or were the deer transported there? We don't know.
Again,
Yeah.
we don't know. It's conceivable that people did bring deer onto the island as part of their camping toolkit, or everybody brings food along when we go camping, right? And when we occupy spaces. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how we would tell either archaeologically whether or not the deer were taken locally or the deer were brought onto Monhegan. So it's
Mhm.
a really good question.
Um, there's a question with a very specific matter, but I'm gonna kind of generalize it to a question about what the recommendations are for finds of stone tools.
That's a really great question.
Yeah.
And I'm currently working with some conservation organizations, and one of my students is also part of this initiative, and the tribal historic preservation officers and the state archaeologists. We're all working together to try and come up with some protocols for how to handle found materials on conservation lands anyway. By law, on private lands, the owner of the land actually owns the collection. So, but in conservation lands, it's a little different because I think uh, one of the things we've talked about is potentially returning those collections to the Wabanaki communities. Penobscot Nation has a new museum. I don't know that the communities have the infrastructure and capacity to accept large collections at this point. Here at the University of Maine, we have large collections as well, and I think we are struggling with space issues as well. I won't necessarily turn away collections, particularly if we have them. We have some from the same location, but it's become a real challenge. And in fact, they call it the curation crisis right now because we just um, don't have the infrastructure, funding, staffing to care for these collections. All that being said, I would say reach out. If you find something, reach out to either the state archaeologist, Dr. Arthur Spees, or you can reach out to me at the University of Maine. I'll often look at collections and help guide people to, what might be the appropriate uh, disposition. But my go-to response is usually if it's in within Wabanaki territory, generally reach out to one of the tribal historic preservation officers and see if they would like them first.
Great. Uh, I know this. So there's a question about, do we know if people who were fishing out by Monhegan also consume lobster as part of their diet? And I imagine that we would have no evidence because lobster shells would not be something that would stay behind in the archaeological record, right?
You are correct. We do not have any evidence of people taking lobster prior to European contact, and I think it is a very flimsy kind of shell compared to some of the other materials that we find archaeologically. That's not to say they didn't. It's just to say that we have not found it yet as archaeologists.
Great. All right. So there is a question again about the chronology. So is I wonder if there's a theory for the apparent lack of Susquehanna phase sword fishing presence on Monhegan. Is it because of the swordfish having been gone by the time? Is that
Yes, so I think that is generally the accepted explanation for why people stop taking swordfish is that our waters cooled to the point to where they were no longer coming in to our area. And so if waters continue to warm as we think they will because of changing climates, you might expect to see swordfish back at Monhegan, or in the Gulf of Maine. But yeah, generally that's what it's viewed as. Culturally, whether or not people kind of assigned to the Susquehanna tradition um, were involved in any kind of swordfish taking, we don't see evidence of that. And so, if there is an overlap at all between kind of the two uh, time periods, then perhaps there is a cultural reason as well.
great? Great. So I'm just gonna quick check and make sure nobody had questions over in the chat as well. Yeah, I think we'll leave it with that. So again, thank you so much for sharing your research with us this evening. And thanks also to everybody for asking such great questions. I know that we can't hear all of you applauding, but I hope you'll join me in a virtual round of applause for Bonnie Newsom. We really appreciate it. And to all of you out there, we look forward to seeing you at the summer series of lectures and workshops. Until then, be well, and thank you so much for being part of the community. Have a great night. Thanks.
Thank you all.